Jared, do you think we give it another minute or two to let people continue to assemble?
Yeah, that sounds good.
Okay, good, because I need that minute or two to try to figure out why my computer won't let me use my camera. And I may or may not be capable of figuring that out.
Well, that's okay. Whatever works. Morning, Brian.
Morning.
Just giving people a couple more minutes to join. There we go.
Had to go grab a different camera. So we're all good. Well, it looks like we've got really good attendance. Jared, do you recommend that we kick this thing off?
That sounds great. Let's start.
Great. Well, thanks. And so for the record, I have 10:01 exactly on Thursday, November 12th, and this is the start of the Workforce and Reengagement Committee of the Youth Development Council. We wanted to start our meeting today with a land acknowledgement, and so I'll share that. And it sounds like this. The Youth Development Council and the Workforce and Reengagement Committee in particular wants to acknowledge the many tribes and bands who call Oregon their ancestral territory and honor the ongoing relationship between the land, plants, animals, and people indigenous to this place we now call Oregon. We recognize the continued sovereignty of the 9 federally recognized tribes who have ties to this place, and we thank them for continuing to teach us how we might all be here together. And then I would just add that I'm personally calling in from the ancestral home of the Kalapuya peoples, and I ask that each of us seek to learn more about the generations of Native people who call the place that we are currently standing or sitting home. And with that, Jared, I guess it is time for roll call.
Thank you. All right. Let's begin roll call. Thank you, everybody, for joining us this morning. I hope everyone had a wonderful Veterans Day. Okay, roll call. Jeff Parker.
Present.
Alicia Hayes.
Present.
Molly Rogers.
Present.
Liz Thorne. Eric Cardella.
Present.
Andy Leonard. Jaime Arredondo. Sam Coe.
Sam is present.
Koi Vu. Destiny Ortiz. Okay. Did I miss anybody on the committee? I think that's it.
Great, thank you, Jared. And we'll just keep our eyes peeled for anyone that joins as we're moving on so that we can make sure that they're entered into the official minutes. Jared, I want to thank you for circulating the minutes again here just recently. I hope everyone on the committee has a copy of them. And if we could take a minute or two to review them, I would then entertain a motion to approve the minutes as written or amend them if people see any discrepancies. Hearing none, can we get a motion to approve the minutes?
Motion to approve the minutes. This is Eric.
This is Molly.
Thanks,
I
Eric.
second.
Thank you, Molly. Any discussion? Great, all in favor, say aye.
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 Any opposed? Great, thank you. And is anyone officially abstaining from that? Excellent, thanks. So the minutes are approved unanimously. I find that in our Zoom landscape, oftentimes we have to hold those votes open longer as people like me panic to get off the mute button. So thanks for everyone jumping in on that. The next item on the agenda is a placeholder that Jared and Paul and I have talked about having kind of as a recurring piece of our meetings, and that is a request for any discussion items from the full committee. And it's twofold. One, if we can populate a list of things that committee members want to talk about, we may be able to get to them today if we can close our business early, or we can then put it on an agenda for a future meeting. And so I would just open it up for all members of the committee to share anything that they would like to get into the queue for this committee to work on or discuss. I'm going to go ahead and share one, and this is a conversation that Paul and Jared and I have had around inviting grantees to join the committee meeting to present on their experience, which I think is a really wonderful thing for committee members to learn and to hear from current grantees and past grantees about what's working for them and what's not working for them. But then in the course of doing that, you know, Paul and Jared and I start to get a little bit of heartburn around the public entity reaching out to a grantee to come do a presentation and how that might be perceived by other grantees that weren't invited, and certainly making sure we're not inviting anyone who's currently an applicant for a grant. So I am curious on what other committee members feel about that, and if people want to talk about that at the end of the meeting, if we have time, great. And if not, then I'm hoping that is something we can put on a future meeting to discuss, just so that we have a thoughtful and transparent process for inviting grantees to come share their experience with us. Any thoughts on that, just initially?
This is Eric. I think it's a great idea. I think it gives some perspective and just connection to the impact that's happening. And in regard to your concern, you know, I think it can be done via you know, an open invite, a survey, you know, something that goes to all of our workforce and re-engagement grantees, you know, or can be you know, maybe targeted by region. Maybe, you know, each quarter when we meet, we want to highlight a different region and kind of open it up to that region. So I think there are ways to kind of address that so that it's not like, you know, hand picking a particular one, but leaving it open. And I think also just the public comment time is, I think often for our committee meetings, and this is from my experience in the past, that, you know, folks might not realize that truly the committee meetings might be the best spot for public comment to actually engage with a smaller group of committee members. So I think in as much as we can be thoughtful about not just presentations, but, you know, encouraging any and all of our grantees to show up and offer public comment, which might just be a soundbite or a thank you or a update, but those are meaningful.
Great, thanks, Eric, and I agree with that. And I see in the chat box here, Cord, thank you for chiming in on that. Certainly, grantees can come and provide public comment, and I really appreciate that. Good, Eric, I liked your ideas about a survey or sort of an open format for grantees to want to provide presentation. And I just think that we can provide some parameters around what we're asking for from that, and then also invite them to come in for public comment. Thanks. Any other thoughts on that? I don't want to shut that conversation down.
Yeah, if I could just interject for one moment. Yeah, I think that's a great suggestion. I agree. You should probably have a standardized process for this. one follow-up question, and maybe we can come back to this at the end or future meetings. If we do invite grantee guests in the future, are there specific things that would be helpful to you all as a committee to hear from them? Are there topics that you would be interested in learning about? Our plan was to pretty much have grantees talk about the challenges they're facing, how they've overcome those challenges, but is there anything else that you'd be interested in?
This is Eric again. I think in addition to folks sharing challenges, which I assume there will be no shortage of, particularly during our current, reality, is asking for reflection on gaps in our, the YDC's reach and scope, and I think that's an opportunity to continue learning, where our workforce and re-engagement grants are reaching and where they're not. So as a council member, that would be appealing, not to make that our grantee's job, but I think if we operate with some transparency, that we're really looking to learn and improve our processes and know where there are gaps in their communities would be hugely valuable. So I think there's actually, I'm looking at the workforce grant questions that were sent out, and essentially that question is on there. Are there gaps in services we should be addressing with these grants? I think that would be a wonderful standing question and opportunity for learning.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. And I think it's important that we also recognize that most recipients are going to be somewhat reticent to provide critical feedback, and that is just that is a relationship between providers and funders across the philanthropic and grant ecosystem. But we really do want that feedback. If something that we're doing is putting barriers that we don't see in front of our recipients, we want to know what that is. And so we need to encourage an environment where that kind of feedback is welcomed.
Hey, Jeff, this is Cord. Quick thought, that's a great point. Something I did not really know about is that ODE does a big customer service survey of everyone who receives any kind of funding from ODE on an annual basis. And I learned about this recently, and we actually do get responses from some YDD grantees. I hadn't previously seen it, but I had a meeting with someone from ODE who showed me that information, and that survey I think happens in January. So something we could do is just try to be more proactive about accessing that information and just kind of looking for anything there in terms of feedback that we want to, at least at staff level, are there things that we see where we can improve processes? I'm happy to say the feedback was for the most part fairly positive, but we do have access to that evaluation, and we can actually promote it more strongly to our grantees and make sure that folks know about it and have that opportunity to give us feedback.
Great, thank you, Cord. That's great. And then for us, I think would be how do we figure out how to share that across the entire council. Thanks for that. I do want to open it up. Any other committee members that have items that they would want to get on either today's agenda or a future agenda? I'll leave it open here for a moment. Great. Well, hearing none, I do want to go backwards for a moment. Apologies for missing one piece in here, which was August meeting follow-up. And there are a couple of questions that were in the minutes that we just approved. And Jared, Paul, or Cord, I'm wondering if you could give us an update on a couple of things. Jared, a question that came under the workforce update was a request from the committee to see examples of different types of metrics collected between workforce and innovation and youth and community grants for comparison and alignment of goals. Mm-hmm. So there were two questions there, and I want to give you, since we have time, I want to give you a second to follow up on that. And then Paul and Cord, there were a couple questions on the summary of request for re-engagement grant applications. Give you both a chance to follow up on those pieces that came out of the August meeting.
Absolutely. So yes, I think this was Eric's question last meeting about alignment of workforce and community metrics. And we mentioned, I think, that there were a couple metrics that were different between the two. And that actually is not the case anymore. That was the case in Q2. I think we were collecting on the workforce grants, whether they earned college credits and were dual enrolled. And it sounds like those were holdovers from what I understand from previous biennia in terms of metrics collected. And so we aligned all of those metrics as of Q3. So those metrics have been the same for both youth and community and workforce grants as they report. So the types of data that we collect, we have gender, race and ethnicity, a variety of characteristics in terms of grade level. Some of the characteristics grantees are able to obtain, some are a little more difficult in terms of poverty status, disability, foster youth, juvenile justice involved youth, items of that nature. And then we have outputs and outcomes that include items such as mentoring, coaching, and case management, hands-on or career-connected learning, post-secondary access, youth who've obtained internship or work experience, school retention, chronically absent youth, and youth that have obtained high school diplomas or GEDs, among some other things. But those are the general metrics that are collected, and those are standardized now between those grants.
Great, thank you, Jared. Any questions from the committee for Jared on his response to that? Excellent. So we'll shift over to Cord and Paul, and I have a feeling that a lot of the stuff is going to be, we're going to dig into this during the bulk of our conversation around priorities discussion. But anything that either of you want to comment on the questions that were in the August minutes?
Jeff, I was going back to the August minutes, trying to find them quickly. Sorry, I was doing minutes for this meeting as well. What were the questions?
Thanks for doing double duty there. That's not easy. One was a question about the role of the YDC in approving the draft of the RFP, I believe. But I think we're past that, so that might be a done question once it came back from DOJ. The other question was whether there will be a best practices resource page that applicants can contact during the application process. And then the comment was that it was in the draft form, so I think just an update on that. And then anything you might want to share about what technical assistance is available.
Yes. So yeah, and I found them just as you were reading them, so thank you. So yes, the YDC did approve the draft approval at the last YDC meeting, and so that has been out. We officially launched the RFAs. I believe it was September 28th. I'm trying to remember off the top of my head, but it was somewhere right around there. So the best practices resource page. So the YDC website has all of the published re-engagement documents that we have out there, and so it outlines the system, it outlines what we're looking for in terms of the process around grants and all of that information. We created a separate tab in the website, and so everything links back to it. Additional best practice resources are going to be updated continually throughout. That's the intent. Some of it has been halted a little bit as we're also working on the new website for YDC, and so there's some of the documents I haven't gotten up onto that site because of some of the technical pieces within that. But all of the grant information is posted on there. So technical assistance, actually, that's why I was running late to the meeting. I was actually on a call for technical assistance coming to this committee meeting, so I apologize for being a minute or two late. But so yeah, it's just some really technical questions coming in around SM Apply, as well as some of the budgeting pieces and some specifics around the questions on that. So pretty general, pretty straightforward stuff that we've been working on addressing. I think our Q&A right now, which is not necessarily technical, we're at 50 some questions. Cord, do you remember where we are on that? I don't quite remember offhand.
I think we've gotten about 45 questions roughly,
Perfect.
or responded to 45 questions. There might be a couple pending right now.
Yes. So I know my email has a few technical questions coming in. As the deadline to close is today for the regional reengagement grant. So there's some specific things around SM Apply that are coming in. I think that applicants are starting to find on that side.
Great, thanks.
Everything, Jeff? Perfect.
Well, I'm sort of curious if there's any broad themes in those in the request for technical or in the questions that are coming in.
I think for the most part, again, kind of being new to this process, and Cord definitely jump in, but I would say the general theme is just some clarifications around kind of what we're looking for within the re-engagement and what those grant dollars will be specifically utilized for. We've had some clarification questions around the 2 different RFAs. I think I've spent some more time on that in terms of the technical side of what does the regional re-engagement look like versus the re-engagement opportunity grant. And so I'd say those are kind of the general themes on it. Cord, do you want to jump in on some of those as well?
Yeah, I mean, what's interesting is that, and I think this is true with every RFA we do, there's a pretty wide range of questions that folks are coming with. Definitely a few questions about partnerships. I mean, I think because both grants require partnerships and one of them is really focused on collaborative work. There have been just kind of questions about, clarifying if something meets requirement, or what's permissible in terms of different applications. But yeah, I would have to look back to see if there were broad themes, but mostly it's been fairly minor clarifications. I think there's only been a couple of things where we've we've kind of said, oh, like this actually is kind of confusing. Like I think that one of the challenges with the Q&A is that you kind of learn about things you might have done differently once you kind of see where the spots are. But overall, I feel like we've been able to address everything pretty quickly and easily. One thing I wanted to make a note of as to kind of respond to the questions from the last, that lingered from the last meeting. We've actually, the RFA has changed, a lot from the concept that we shared at the last meeting. And to a degree, some of that was influenced by the meeting. I think that there were some ideas that we had that we kind of saw an opportunity to implement. So there was some last minute changes, but I think that they've been really beneficial, particularly in addressing the concerns about access to the grants, really making it, just removing barriers for, for other, just trying to make sure that it's open to more communities, making sure that it is a little less prohibitive. I mean, the opportunity grant in particular, which when Paul gives the update on re-engagement, he may talk a little bit about what the process looks like. But we're really excited about what we were able to do, and I think the committee discussion was really informative in helping us to make some improvements before we launched this thing. So this was a really good resource for us to bring our initial plan and refine it.
Great, thanks, Paul, and thanks, Cord. And I agree, and I appreciate the quick pivot on some of the things that the committee brought up, particularly around the use of school district as a defining limitation and ways to open this up to more of our rural communities. So definitely appreciated to see that pivot. I think we'll hold off on the question about the rubric, scoring rubric, because I think that will come up during Jared's discussion about the grant itself. So why don't we just jump into the re-engagement update? Paul, I will hand it off to you, and just sort of a time check. The agenda has 5 minutes for the update.
Absolutely. So as Cord was saying, as part of the feedback from this committee, we have the 2 separate grants. So the regional re-engagement grant is really focused on creating those regional collaboratives and the work at a bigger scale, providing all of the re-engagement services. It's exciting to be at the point where that grant application actually closes today. at 5, and so we're anxiously waiting to see what that looks like with the applicants on that process. And then the Reengagement Opportunity Grant really is something I think Cord and I had kind of discussed throughout, but we had definitely broadened it with the sense that we wanted any eligible entity to be able to apply for these grant funds throughout the state. And so the Opportunity Grant isn't focused solely on the priority regions, those 8 priority regions. And to be honest, I don't remember if we discussed the 3 or the 8 priority regions, but we do have 8 priority regions identified in both of those grant applications. So it's a pretty broad sense throughout Oregon. And the Opportunity Grant, what we're seeing is a lot more smaller entities applying with some specific re-engagement services. So as part of that grant, education has to be accessed by the participants or be available to the participants. But we're seeing, what I'm hoping we're going to see is really some individualized supports focused on any of those re-engagement system or services that are provided. And so I think it'll be a broader scale of that. That grant actually closes on Tuesday, this coming next Tuesday on that side. So we'll be going through the grant review process on that. Speaking of the grant review process, we are, yesterday I sent out the training links, or excuse me, Tuesday I sent out the training links for all of our reviewers. And so we have expanded that review process to include a self-paced review, our self-paced training that reviewers will go through as part of the norming process on the rubric. And so excited to see how that goes. And my understanding is that's new for YDD and YDC. So excited to see how that moves forward with it. It's about a 33-minute video of me kind of walking through what re-engagement is, and then also some norming processes. As part of that, we also created a sample application for reviewers to review and start working with the rubric instead of just going straight into the grant applications. I think a couple other pieces that we've done, we did do an addendum to the scoring rubric where we have weighted questions, and that's out on the website in terms of it. So each question is weighted differently and scored accordingly with those weighted scores. And so we'll see how that moves forward within that. Through the review process, and honestly through us building this training as both myself writing that, but also then working with the grant managers and other YDD staff, I think we've identified a few areas that we'll definitely try to rework or think about as we move forward with the next RFA. So it's been a really good process in terms of it. Thank you, Cord. Cord posted the link to the website and the re-engagement Q&A piece on it. The other piece that I think we did that was new is we did do a webinar launch with the RFAs, and that was October 2nd after we had released it, and that we got really good feedback from applicants saying that they appreciated the detail and the information that was presented on that. I believe we were about 88 people that attended, or 88 participants in that presentation as well, and that's also posted on the website as well. With that, I'll go ahead and open it up for any questions people might have. With it just closing, there is kind of limited detail that I can go into, I'm sure. Corey, did you have anything else to add as well?
No, that's a great summary. And, you know, I want to sort of like publicly praise you, Paul, for having never done an RFA with YDD before. You know, I'm just really just super impressed with your, you know, flexibility and problem solving and really like the big lift of getting this thing launched. And you know, this is, I think, a different process from what we've done before, especially in terms of the webinar at the beginning, where we actually did a lot of the Q&A live, in terms of like pumping out these Q&A responses, developing a lot of documents to really support it. So just, you know, great job, Paul, on this. It's really exciting to see this thing come together.
Cord, you took the words out of my mouth. Great work, Paul. I really appreciate all of your effort on this. I would like to again ask any questions that committee members might have for you on what you just presented to us.
Absolutely.
I do have one curiosity around the selection of reviewers, and I don't know if there's a standard YDC process for that, but I'm just hoping you could just share that with me and other committee members, because I just don't know what that is.
Absolutely. So it's a little bit different in that we are going to have YDD staff as part of the review team. So the review teams are made up of five members, and so we have some YDD staff, which is new as part of that. And then we put out an all call out to contacts and in the ODE executive team asking for volunteers to be a part of it. So there are obviously YDD staff, but then there are ODE staff joining the review committees as well as other state members. And then we also have some community members that have joined volunteer wise. And then from there, we did a random selection of all of the volunteers and placed them onto teams regards to that. So you'll have a pretty well-rounded team, I believe.
Awesome, thank you. And it's a pretty ambitious time schedule to get these done, if I remember correctly.
It varies. I think I have about 3 days to get the information ready to once all of the applications are reviewed to get it ready for the December 10th meeting. So yes, we're about 7 days for our volunteers to independently review the applications.
Great. Thank you, Paul. I'll hold it open here for another 30 seconds or so if anyone has a question for Paul about the re-engagement update. Okay, well, let's move on to the next agenda item. Jared, to you on the workforce grant update.
Great, thank you. All right, just to give you all a brief update on the workforce grants. So last time we gave you data as of quarter three. Quarter 5 has just closed for all of our grantees. Many of them are still reporting on their quarter 5 data. So we pulled data for quarter 4 up through quarter 4. So just to give you an update from last time, and also in this report, I'm including some youth and community grants that also do have a heavy workforce component to them. So across our workforce grants and some of those community grants that have that workforce component, we've served over 1,500 youth to date. Just for quarter 4, we had approximately 117 that obtained a high school diploma, about 34 that obtained a GED, and about 56 that re-engaged in school. So now that the academic year is done, we were able to get some of that data, and that's great. Despite the closures with schools, we had over 300 youth that completed a hands-on or career-connected learning experience, and about 115 or so that completed an internship last quarter. In terms of demographics, we have over 600 youth that listed poverty status. Again, that's probably higher. The real number is probably higher because some youth obviously don't report that, and some of that information is not available to some of our grantees. So that is probably higher. And over 150 reported having a disability. So just some interesting numbers there. In terms of demographics, very similar to last time. About 35% of the youth served were white. About 20% were Black or African American. About 17% Hispanic or Latino. About 15% 2 or more races. About 2.5% American Indian or Alaska Native, and about 10% that fall into other categories. In terms of challenges, of course, COVID-19 remains the main challenge for all of our grantees. In the reports that we're getting, we're hearing a lot of those challenges that have continued. Of course, by now, a lot of the grantees have figured out how to restructure the programs and how to make things work in a remote or in a hybrid setting. But those challenges remain, and those main challenges are retention and recruitment. A lot of programs are struggling to recruit new youth, especially programs that recruit youth from schools when the schools are, not in person. So many programs are still focusing on retaining the youth that they've already been serving and focusing on really providing that enhanced service for youth who need those services right now. Mental health supports, of course, mental health, anxiety, depression, that continues to be a major challenge that youth are facing. So programs have often had to step up, and in many cases, programs, they're not licensed counselors, but they've had to sort of step in with that additional mentoring piece to address those needs. Access to technology and internet. We know that that's an equity issue, especially in our more rural parts of the state, and that continues to be a challenge. Many grantees have found additional funding that has enabled them to provide laptops or hotspots or what have you. And we're trying to help grantees where we can with that as well. And job placement and in-person programming, of course. Job placement is difficult right now, and in-person programming in many cases is not possible. So again, grantees have really done a great job at restructuring their programs and trying to do things in a remote setting, in some cases a hybrid setting, and in some cases they're able to really do it fully in person as long as everyone is spaced out and has the proper protective equipment on. But it continues to be a challenge, and we're navigating that with our grantees and seeing where that goes. But again, many grantees have actually reported that this, they're better set up for the future now because they've had to restructure their programs and had to transition to online services, which they wouldn't have anticipated originally. But now that they have that capability, they can reach more people through an online component. So there are benefits to it. Certainly challenges, but I think grantees realize that this might be the status quo for quite a while. So they're doing a great job at trying to make things work.
Jared, thanks for that summary. Certainly, I want to open it up for questions from committee members. I have a couple easy ones, I think, but I'll hold them until we see if others have questions. And also, I would add, if committee members feel if it's easier to put a question in the chat box, all of us will kind of be bouncing back and forth. Well, Jared, two quick questions around performance. So, because of the pandemic, I should know this, but I don't. Has there been any conversation, or do we have the ability to extend the period of performance on current grants, just so that they can have a longer time to spend that money? And then the other part of that question is, what sort of flexibility can we have in the budgets as grantees have had to pivot where their attention is and where they might need to be spending money to be effective in their outcomes?
Sure. So yes, to your first question, outcomes. I think. Well, let me talk actually about the budgets first. We're really trying to be flexible with grantees where we can. In our budget amendment process. So grantees will come and they'll say, such and such is not possible anymore. We're really trying to shift into some other area of service, or provide youth with what they need. And so we're pretty much saying, yes, we're trying to be flexible. Of course, there are parameters that we have to stay within, but if we can assist a grantee to provide the funding for the youth that they need, that's going to best serve the communities, we're trying to be pretty flexible in terms of budget amendments. So we've let everybody know that if you need to amend your budgets, if something is going to work better for your grant program, reach out to us, and we go through that process of making sure everything looks okay and we approve it, and provide that flexibility where we can. In terms of extending the deadlines, my understanding is that no, for the most part, the money has to be spent by June 30th of 2021. Cord, is that also the case for Title 20 grantees, or is there? Actually, that doesn't. Well, there are no Title 20 workforce grantees actually, so that doesn't really apply in this situation.
Yeah, for the state general funds, unfortunately, unless there's a significant change in state fiscal laws, we can't go past June 30th. Everything essentially hits the biennial timeline, and my sense though is that folks are still utilizing funding on a pretty steady basis. I know I'm sure there are some grants that are underspending, but it's not as significant of a concern as I thought it might be, just based on my like kind of quick look at where things are at. You know, because even though in-person services are impacted, I mean, staffing, you know, is still happening, and folks even working remotely, you know, there's still a lot of work being done. And going back to the budget flexibility that Jared mentioned, like what we've decided to do is just try to create as much opportunity for grantees to be responsive to the needs of youth and to be able to be flexible in their programming. And I think that's helped to keep spending on track so that we're not looking at significant amounts of money not being utilized.
Yeah, I would say that's correct. And you know, even though many programs are not able to run in person anymore, there are major startup costs to transitioning that to an online setting. So so money is still being spent, certainly. Yeah.
Great. Thank you, Jared and Cord. Any other questions from committee members? And Sam wrote in the chat box, thank you, Sam, my JDEP and LTCT grantees are still spending their funding this biennium. And I think that's the goal for all of us, right, is we wanted to get this money out there so that it could increase effectiveness, and we certainly want to see grantees using it. I want to pause here for a second. I want to do sort of a secondary roll call, and if any committee members have joined the call since we did roll call, can you just let us know that you're in here? All right, then the original roll call will stand. Thanks. Thank Jared, thank you, Cord. Jared, again, next agenda item is you, which is workforce priorities discussion. And I will hand it over to you.
Okay, thank you. All right, so moving into kind of the main conversation for today, we wanted to have a discussion about our workforce priorities and our workforce grants going forward. At YDD, we've begun in recent months to have some strategic planning conversations about what the future of our grants will look like, what our areas of priority are, how we can align the different areas of our office better. And so we really wanted to solicit your input and your advice on how we can do that. I think with our workforce grants, they're in some ways slightly different from some of our other sources of funding in that they're a little bit less restricted in terms of age that we serve, in terms of priorities that we set out to achieve, types of programs that we fund. And so we just wanted to open it up to the committee to hear from you on what areas you think are important for us and how we should best design our grants going forward to meet the needs of the communities we serve. I will pull up the questions that I sent out. I don't know if anybody had a chance to look at these ahead of time. Can people see that on the screen? Okay, so these were some questions that we sent out, general questions, and I guess we can just go through them and just have a conversation about what you see as areas of need, if anything has arisen since COVID, if you know of anything in the community that is happening that might be good for us to know, anything that you think that would help us inform our process for our workforce grants in the next biennium. So I guess we can start with number one, just what initiatives or areas of priority do you feel are important for YDD workforce grants to fund? And we've listed some areas here. That is by no means all the areas that we could focus on, but those are probably the main umbrella of what we focus on right now. What do you feel is important? What else could we think about? What are your thoughts on that?
Jared, it's a quiet bunch today, so I'm hoping that people want to respond to that question because it's one of the most critical questions.
Jared, this is Eric. Are you asking specifically about the first question or overall?
Yes, the first question right now.
First question. Okay.
Overall, what areas of priority do you think we should focus on? Is it skill development, internships, job coaching, entrepreneurships, other?
Is it best just to jump in, or how would you like me to communicate that? Is there, I can't find a little hand raising thing.
Oh, let's see. That's a good idea. My screen is so small now because I'm sharing my screen that I'm trying to find.
Sorry.
No,
And this is, so I guess the initiatives and areas, I think they are all really great. What I do think is we have to have an overlayer of in the world we currently live in, right? Yeah. So how do we overlay understanding that this is looking at July 2021, but not knowing what that's going to look like is technology readiness, or at least acknowledging this notion of how to do this all in alternative methodologies. And I'm not sure that that's a priority or what we need to do, but I do really want to make sure that we look at it through the lens of still having COVID-19 impacts.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think that's something that we're definitely very cognizant of and that we're thinking about, is that it's a complicating factor right now. You know, it's complicated to determine what we want as priorities in a normal year, and now with COVID and just with so many unknowns. I think, for instance, a lot of internships are fantastic programs. Some of them have not been able to run because of COVID. So there's just so much uncertainty right now. And I think, yeah, that's a great point.
Hey, Jared, can I maybe add a little bit of some of my thinking on this question in a way that I might frame it?
Please.
So I think that in our current and previous workforce grants, we've sort of asked for all of the above. That we've kind of had a pretty broad set of things that we have asked folks to do, and we've not really prioritized any one of these things. And the way that I mean, these are 4 pretty broad areas that the first 3 I sort of think of as a continuum of service. So there's a first step, and then there's the very supported placement in a job, and ultimately placement, out in the workplace. The entrepreneurship, social enterprise, that stuff has been something we've previously emphasized in our grants, and it's kind of just the seasoning. It's just kind of been a part of it. And so when we were talking about this question, what I was sort of thinking about is, do we, in terms of our grant priorities, does it still make sense to say, like, do all of the above? Or is there an area that would make sense to emphasize more? And kind of looking at that from, like, how are we, if we're aligning with other, with the STEM work that might be happening through ODE programs, or the workforce stuff happening over at the HEC, is there, are there certain priorities here that we should elevate because that might be the sweet spot for our grants? Or does it actually just really make sense to just have it be broader, because that just gives folks the maximum flexibility to design their program?
This is Eric. I'll offer some perspective, just having been part of the committee for a while. I mean, I think what we've heard, I think we've heard through the committee and the council, but also I've heard just from grantees in general, outside of kind of official committee communications, is appreciating that YDC's investments allow for responsiveness, I guess, and kind of alignment with whatever, a wider variety of activities. However, the other side of that becomes difficult for us to track, impact and outcomes over time if we are kind of just so open. So I don't know if that helps I would say from the grantee perspective, I feel like, and Corey, you probably could speak more to this from like your community engagement work over the years, but I feel like the openness, you know, giving 4 or 5 plus an other category, you know, has been well received from grantees, but it is also what has made it difficult to track, you know, consistent outcomes over time. So I think it's just a time frame to really address, you know, for us as a committee, and it may be a larger council priority, say, is the responsiveness to community needs, you know, our primary focus, or is it moving the needle on a couple of key issues, which might mean being a little less, not less responsive, but more targeted, I guess. So I don't have an answer to that, but I do think it's an important question.
Thanks, Eric. Does anybody else have any general thoughts on programs that you know of that are, you know, working well, things that historically, you know, if you've been part of YDC for a while, if there have been workforce areas that you would like us to focus more on?
Okay, Jared, I appreciate the question, and it's one of those like, which of your children do you love the most questions? You know, because the answer is yes to all of them. We really want to make sure that we've got all of those things. And I appreciate Eric's comment around the flexibility. One of the things that I really want to make sure we do is we're not forcing high quality programs and high quality organizations into a space that they're less effective with our priorities. Like, if they're doing great work and having great outcomes, that's an organization we should invest in. And so I think there's a balance there in terms of what we say the priorities are and what the priorities may be in a particular community.
Mm-hmm.
Can I ask a follow-up question to, I guess, Sam and Molly? You know, one of the things I'm thinking about here are how do we measure, you know, our success in any of these areas? But I'd be curious for Sam, you know, if you have thoughts on what you might want to see us measure in terms of how we know that we're doing a good job with skill development. And Molly, I mean, you brought up a great set of services that I hope we actually see people developing. And, you know, if you have thoughts on how we might measure our success in preparing young people for this maybe very prolonged remote way of operating.
Hi, this is Sam. And when I like wanted to focus on skill development, work readiness, and it was because of the fact that and then for those of you that don't know, like at ODE, our unit works with kids in county detention and OIA facilities, correctional facilities, and then what we're finding is some of our youth, they can find jobs, but they have a hard time keeping their jobs. And then the term that our kids sometimes are lacking are soft skills, like for instance, how to take constructive feedback, how to deal with, you know, teammates or co-workers and so forth. And our YSEP sites have been participants in University of Oregon's pilot study on the curriculum wages in the past. And I forgot what wages stands for. And then it's a curriculum that University of Oregon Transition Center has been developing for kids in correctional settings to participate in so that they can develop the soft skills. And for me, so that's my focus. So that was the rationale for me selecting skill development, work readiness. And even while the kids are in the OI facilities, they can earn jobs in the kitchen or with the custodial crew, but having the kids actually, you know, continue their employment within OIA sometimes is also a challenge. So that's why I selected that.
Yeah, thanks. This is Molly, and metrics for connectivity and access through the COVID lens. You know, I can just think of how we would do that here in our own shop. If we were responding to it, the metrics would be probably on a individual basis or an aggregate with the schools. Yeah, let me think about that a little bit more, because you're right. Measurement would be absolutely critical, and I'm still thinking on that one I think the easy answer is, how many houses or how many youth report that they're not able to hook on because of internet, but that is an easy question to ask. It's not an easy question to answer.
Mm-hmm.
And Molly, this is Sam. Remember a couple years ago when you had the tools program out at Norcor? So if I remember correctly, that was also a work readiness program, correct?
Yes, absolutely. It was transition. Yeah. Yes.
Great. Yeah, and I think that's, in terms of measuring success, that's an ongoing discussion that we have as grant managers as well, is what metrics should we be capturing to really paint a picture of the story that's happening with our grantees. So if there are areas that you think we should hone in on, please let us know.
Hey, Jared, just a question here as we're having this conversation. I think it'd be helpful as a reminder, when does the next set of these grants go out? I mean, we have some time to work on this, right? Or am I wrong?
So we have to develop the RFAs for the next set pretty quickly, within the next couple of months. The next biennium grants would start on July 1st of 2021. So
yeah, people are already starting to look at their next year fiscal year budget. So I would encourage us to be as aggressive and assertive as getting these done as possible.
Yeah.
Okay, because I was also just going through my notes from the last time we did this, and I had crunched some of the numbers and on terms of who the awardees were, and so that does make sense. That's a more aggressive timeline than I was thinking, so that's very helpful. Thanks.
Yeah, it is. I think the goal is to have the RFAs open probably early spring, late winter, early spring, and then the funding would go out July 1st.
I'm not going to throw up our timeline because it's still a bit of a work in progress, but I think that our ideal time to have a finished RFA open would be in the month of February. And so that would mean that, through November and December and into January, really nailing down the priorities of the grants and developing all the processes for that. We could probably get it done if we slid a little bit later, like into March, but for those that have been around, like it gets really hard to get our grants to start on time if we open the process any later, just given the window for responses and reviewing and bringing it back to the council. So that's kind of, I think that we're looking at about a, say, 2.5 to 3.5 month period between now and when we'd like to have a finished product.
Great. I think that's helpful framing for all of us. So my follow-up question to you, the three of you, would be, if the committee members here don't see any significant changes on these questions that you've asked of us, would you go forward with an RFA that looks an awful lot like the one from 2 years ago? And then maybe another way of asking that question is, really specifically, what do you need from us today to help inform the work that you're going to do over the next 2 months?
So for the first question, would we go forward with something that that looks like what we have right now? I think it's possibly. I think it's kind of very up in the air right now. We're really in the stages of determining what we want to focus on. Feel free to jump in, Cord, if you have other thoughts there. But I think I think things probably could look similar. I think we are trying to align workforce and re-engagement in our office as well. And so we're trying to sort of fit a lot of these workforce programs into the new re-engagement model. And we'll get into that as we go through the questions as well. So I think there probably will be more of a re-engagement focus within the workforce grants and vice versa. But I think in terms of programs that we fund and the types of work they do, they will probably be very similar, but maybe with an enhanced re-engagement focus is what I would think.
Yeah, and I think to your question of, for today, I mean, really, we wanted to ask these questions and have this conversation. That's really what I think need is input to help us sort of refine some of this thinking. I mean, particularly, as Jared mentioned, we'll talk more about re-engagement and how it fits, but the next two questions are kind of focused on the populations that fall outside of the re-engagement mission, where I still think that, and I mean, this is my opinion, that I think that there's still a place for workforce programs to be serving youth before and after that re-engagement window. But I'm not quite sure what that looks like. So that was a thing we wanted to really share with the committee today to get input on.
Great, thank you. I think the one observation I would share is that since we had this RFA in 2019, the council itself and this committee have done some pretty comprehensive work around sort of our footing and our values. And one of the things that we wrestled with a bunch is making sure that we're highlighting an equity lens in the work that we're doing. And so from that perspective, when again, back to my comment and maybe back to what Eric was saying too, is every community has different needs, slightly different needs. And so, I think our responsibility from an equity perspective is to have enough flexibility that applicants from each community can access fund for what their specific need is. And so that's where I, again, gets a little bit trepidation around valuing one of these priorities over another. And then and the big one that's on there is the other, because I think that there's probably plenty of stuff that we don't have on this list that would be of really high value, high impact for a particular community.
Yeah. That's great feedback. Thank you.
So this is Molly. I have a quick question. Going back to the people that responded to our RFA last time, were you, even just in stories or anecdotes, were you able to glean any from them on what their experience was on their response to it? And if they felt like, I really appreciate the DEI and discussion on if they would have any recommendations to us on how to improve it. So just out of a curiosity of getting a user's perspective, just a quick survey on what their experience was like.
Molly, you're talking about their experience responding to the RFA?
Yes, because many of the providers that responded to the RFA tend to work with this population or have real passion about this population or have been doing some work in this. Just if I remember right, thinking who came in, it's just really asking what their experience was like in responding to this RFA. And to be honest with you, if you have a list of the people who weren't awarded the grant, what their frustrations were in responding to the RFA. So, I'm always around the experiential of what we do, just feeds us to make it so much better. So I was just curious. I don't know.
Mm-hmm. Well, I actually was not at YDD yet when they responded to the RFA. I might not be the one to speak to that. Cord, are you able to provide a little bit more?
Yeah, I think I could say a few things about that. I mean, one of the things that happened with the 2019 RFA, so much of what we're doing right now with re-engagement is taking the lessons we learned in 2019 and trying to improve on some of the things that did not work well. One thing we did was we took back a lot of control of development of the RFA. maybe, you know, we kind of have to work with both the Department of Justice and the ODE's procurement team. But for this re-engagement RFA, we actually managed to maintain pretty strong control over the content, whereas in 2019, there were things that we like folks said, this is confusing, and we're like, yeah, it is, you know, and we're sorry. I mean, one of the things that I don't think was that helpful was that for all the different types of grants, it was the same 4 questions. I think that was the decision made with the desire of making it simpler for folks, but for, you know, for a workforce grant versus a gang grant, I think there are some really different priorities and some really different assets that we might want to see, and some different ideas we're going to want to get from the proposals that I feel like asking the right questions really benefits the review process and pulls out stuff that I think results in better grants being made. So that was the thing that folks brought up to us. I had several people give me that feedback. They were like, I applied for the workforce and the community grant. It was the same questions. Like, why is that? And, you know, I think that was well-intentioned, but that actually kind of hurts folks, because I think you don't want to ask 200, you know, or 20 questions with 500-word answers. It can be too much for both the applicant and the reviewer. But a few differentiated questions that really get at the key goals, whatever they are, I think is important. So that's one thing. I think that the other thing that we've tried to adjust in the re-engagement process, and this will be a bit of a learning for us, is trying to have a better review process. So that, you know, the idea of having teams that have a staff person involved is meant to support both the, you know, helping folks when we want to bring the team together, which previously reviewers reviewed individually. They did their scores, submitted their scores, and that was it. And the reviewers never spoke to each other about grants. There was no opportunity for reviewers to say, hey, like, now that I've talked to you about this, I understand this, and I think I actually would give that a higher score now that I've heard your perspective. We didn't really create that opportunity, and I think that's a common thing in grant reviews, and so we wanted to do that, and we wanted to have staff involved in part to facilitate those conversations. And so, I mean, this isn't really, like, folks are frustrated if they don't get funded, period, but our hope is that we can have a process that is a little bit more nuanced in terms of the reviews, both providing like clear, very standardized, normed ways of evaluating the scores, but also facilitating conversations so that everyone's on the same page about what a project is, and if someone sees something really positive, they have a chance to advocate for that work to the rest of the reviewers. And our hope is that that helps to elevate really good projects, where if it's just scoring done in isolation, you know, there isn't really that chance. So that is the reason for some of the changes that we've made. So, I mean, those are just 2 examples that come to mind of things where I think we said, how can we make this a little bit better?
Great. Does anybody have anything else to add to number 1? Other questions before we move on to number 2?
No, thanks, Jared. Hey, I just want to point out, Cord, you just expressed something that I guess I didn't really know, and that is that we're asking the same 4 questions, or we did ask the same 4 questions on all 3 of those grants or grant offerings. Is that something that staff are going to address, or how do we make sure that we don't repeat that?
I mean, I'd say, yeah, we definitely, I'll just say that I am strongly encouraging us not to do that again.
Great. Well, I guess my question would be, do you need assistance? Would staff appreciate assistance from this committee developing the questions specific to workforce and innovation?
Yeah, you know, and maybe this goes back to the question from the last meeting about getting committee and council input on RFAs. Like, we've just been trying to figure out the best way to do that, where we don't want to release the RFA early by virtue of it being a public meeting. I mean, part of that's part of this, you know, maybe a follow-up discussion to this would be like, what are the things that you really want to know from the applicants for our grants? So I think the answer to that is yes. We just have to figure out a good way to do it. But I think we want to ask questions that get at the priorities of the committee. So I think the answer is yes.
Great. Thank you, Cord. I appreciate that. And Jared, I'm also cognizant of the clock here. So let's move into the other question. I think some of the other questions go quicker, but let's go ahead and move down. Cord, I appreciate your answer then. And I know that all of us on the committee would be happy to help however we can best fit in.
Great. Thank you. All right, so moving into some of the more concrete aspects of this. Are we serving the appropriate age range, and should we expand that age range that we serve to include some younger youth? And what priorities, if we did expand to include younger youth, what priorities would we have in programming? So right now, currently, our workforce grants, youth ages 14 to 24 are eligible to access our workforce grants. Could we go, you know, maybe 10 to 14, 12 to 14? Does that look like more skill development and kind of, obviously no one's being placed in jobs at that age, but could we have more kind of business preparedness or financial literacy classes geared toward younger youth that might interest more youth in those areas?
This is Eric. I really have been impressed and surprised and you know, just overall really pleased with some of the middle school programming that I've seen as long as I've been on the council. I mean, I'm thinking about some of the financial literacy and like social enterprise, like, I mean, Cord can help me out, but I mean, we've seen some really interesting like micro business type of programs with middle schoolers where they're like selling school supplies to younger kids and things like that. And so I would say certainly middle school, we've seen some awesome programs, and I don't know that I would put them in a particular category. I mean, the assumption is that they're not doing job placement in middle school, but there could certainly be, you know, career coaching and early intervention. So from my perspective, and Cord, sorry to put it back to you, but Cord can share more from experiences visiting programs and things that have been shared out to the council and the committee in the past. I think that that's actually been one of the more innovative and interesting aspects of our, particularly our innovation portfolio, has been the middle school programming.
Yeah, I mean, I just put it in the chat. I mean, the Boys and Girls Club of Corvallis was the program that I think Eric might have been mentioning, because I was like totally enamored with it. They essentially had their 4th and 5th grade, so pre-middle school youth, took over operation of the club store. You know, so they were really running a retail business and managing everything from inventory to store hours to the you know, essentially the cash till. But they used you know, club bucks, which are an incentive that they distribute through the club and at schools. And it was really really impressive because it provided a lot of the skill building through like a real hands-on model, but you know, also like just gave the young people a ton of agency. It was very youth-led. I mean, it expanded to the group that was running it, developed like end-of-year celebration packages where they, you know, sold like parties to other parts of the club. They even had to like figure out like essentially like currency policy, because there'd be inflation when too many club bucks were out and they'd have to adjust their prices. So it was like some really high-level skill development. I mean, and there's a part of it that, you know, I think it was just the club had a really interesting vision and there were some really dynamic staff who drove that idea. But, you know, I think that another thing we see with middle schoolers is that it does really focus on like soft skills a lot of times. Like I'm thinking of, I mean, I think Great by 8th is not necessarily a workforce focused program, but the Boys and Girls Club have, you know, I think it's really like developing a lot of those soft skills and collaboration and leadership skills that ultimately come into play once you're getting more towards employment. And, you know, it hasn't been a thing we focused on. We haven't actually sought this stuff out. that Boys and Girls Club store project was an innovation project. It wasn't in the workforce category. So, part of this question is sort of asking, we've seen these successes. Do we want to try to cultivate this more and sort of create a space where it's really something we are wanting to seek out and support?
Hey, Cord, I appreciate that. And Eric, I also appreciate your comment. Just in case people aren't seeing it, Sam put in the chat box that, we want to expand. Before we expand the ages, we have to ascertain a level of funding that will be available with the specific point of not wanting to water down the resources when they become tighter. And I'm on another screen here. I'm looking at what I think was the data that I collected after the 2019 grants. We had certainly more applicants than we had funded. We had more applicants than we funded by a long shot, and I think we had almost twice as much requests as we had money, maybe even slightly more. So Sam, to your point, that's very real. It is a limited resource, and I think that that is something we want to consider as we think about expanding age range.
Eric, again, this is Molly. I really agree with that. I've been around a long time. I wish Alicia was still on here. I really love serving younger populations, but I will tell you the excitement around this one was this hidden population that never gets funding. They're the prickly, ickly kids. And so I really would want us to be very careful to expand on that, knowing that we had twice as many requests as we did money last time. So I would really encourage us not to. And if for some crazy reason the grants came in and they only wanted to spend half as much, then I think that would be a wonderful program or problem for us to then go back out and ask. But I would really hope that we don't change that portion for us, that this is a group of kids that's often left behind, and that if we have really worthy programs out there, that we put pressures on our partnerships to make sure that those are funded.
Thanks, Molly.
Thanks, Molly. And then if people don't see it in the chat box, also Eric's comment that really when we're talking about that younger population, he feels that is more of the innovation piece as opposed to the workforce piece. So there might be that might make a little bit more sense in terms of where the investment on innovation goes.
And this is a great conversation. This is Eric again. I think part of the potentially limited resources or maybe more demand than supply, might be at play. And I think that's a totally valid concern. Maybe this has been addressed, but to what extent are there going to be priority? Is priority going to be given for disconnected youth, or what we've called opportunity youth, which would be in that older population and disconnected from education and workforce? Because I think that might come into play. I mean, I guess my thought is I don't know that I would want to exclude an entire population of younger youth, but I would also be in favor of prioritizing our youth that are disconnected as a target population. So I think that both of those things can exist, so that we don't close the door before the RFA even goes out, but continue to keep focused on the population that we want to move the needle on. So can somebody speak to that, or maybe it's already been addressed and I missed it, to what extent there will be kind of weight or priority for programs that serve disconnected youth as opposed to in school youth?
Hey, Eric, I'd like to start, and I feel like there's some context that I can provide that might be really helpful here, and Paul may want to chime in as well. So with Reengagement, with the Reengagement Fund and the Reengagement grants, our budget for the next biennium is definitely a work in progress, but it's possible that we are funded at the level that we've expected to be with Reengagement, and that's going to be an additional $8 million plus for the 21 to 23 biennium. And Reengagement eligibility currently is ages 14 to 21, youth who are either not in school and have not graduated or completed, It can be youth who are behind and not on track for graduation. So that kind of ends up being your alternative school population, or youth that are struggling in public schools. Youth who are referred by, there's a number of agencies and entities that are identified as referral partners, where they can refer any youth, and if they say you should re-engage or go to a re-engagement program, they have access. It includes OIA, DHS, juvenile departments, juvenile court judges, school districts, tribes, a whole number of entities can refer. So the re-engagement grants will be pretty accessible, and are the first group that is eligible to engage in a re-engagement program are 14 to 21-year-olds who are not in school and have not finished. But that leaves out the 21 to 24-year-olds. And so knowing that, like that group of, say, 17-plus-year-olds who have graduated and gotten a diploma, but are currently opportunity youth, they're disconnected from school and work. We know that about half of all opportunity youth actually have their diploma or GED. When you're talking about those older opportunity youth, it's an even bigger portion. So these are kids that finished high school but haven't transitioned on to whatever comes next. So that's kind of a distinct population from the re-engagement program service group that we're talking about. So there's a couple of things that we're looking at. We have a legislative concept, so it should be turned into a bill this session. It was meant to clarify some of the re-engagement statutes, but we've actually gone ahead and we're trying to get the re-engagement statutes to change to allow youth all the way up to 24 to enroll in a re-engagement program. And the reason is that, back when the re-engagement legislation first got written, it was using school funding. So the original eligibility is really based on high school eligibility. But once this ceased to be school money, it's now grants, and it's now something that not just school districts can do. We want to align it with everything else that we do with our grants. We want it to have the same flexibility and the same accessibility as the workforce grants and any other YDD grant. So we have to get that through the legislative process, and if that happens, then somewhere within the next, during this coming biennium, our eligibility for re-engagement could officially go up to age 24. But for the current, as we're working on grants, we're not going to know if that's the case. So I just say all that to kind of say that there is a group of young people that we're going to have a lot more resources available to serve, and those are those 14 to 21-year-olds who are not in school. But now for the older youth, that's kind of, is that where workforce grants would need to be focused more for the youth that have finished high school but haven't been able to successfully transition to a job or to post-secondary education. So I just kind of wanted to like share that, because that is kind of a work in progress, but the goal is for us to have re-engagement be a little bit more expansive, and it's going to be a real significant increase. When the Workforce and Innovation Grant was about $2 million, so $8 million is really a substantial increase in resources for these young people.
Hey, Cord, I think to add to some of the clarity about the younger age group too, is that I think, yes, out-of-school youth 14 to 21 is part of the re-engagement, but one of the challenges that we've discussed, or at least I've been thinking about, is how do we access those 14-year-olds or even that middle school transition a little bit to help support it in greater depth? Because the re-engagement dollars for like a freshman who's typically going to be 14, unless they're not behind in credits, and so unless they physically drop out, there's not many support needs in place on that. So I think part of the younger age group has come up is because there is a little bit of limitation there in that 7th, 8th, 9th grade range of accessing it within the re-engagement dollars, except for the alternative of them dropping or being part of the juvenile system.
I appreciate the context and the conversation. And I don't really have anything more. I just want to affirm that the feedback and context are really important, and I think I hope that we can find a way to keep an option open for middle school programming in some capacity, but without taking any, without taking any oomph away from a target population, which I think, Cord identified a couple of key, gaps that I think we need to address.
Great, thanks, Eric. I agree with that. I would just ask, I would ask Paul, Jared, and Cord if, like, did you get what you needed out of our conversation there, or did we end up making it more confusing?
No, I think
I was going to say I really like Eric's suggestion of, not muddy. I think that work with middle schoolers, with that, say, 11 to 14-year-olds, is not workforce development. We're not really getting them into jobs. But I think that, what I think Paul was getting at is that it's a really important juncture for transition and prevention of needing re-engagement later. And I think, we didn't really put it in the questions, but understanding what to do with innovation is something that we've also been throwing around as we think about our grants. And maybe there's a place where it's really more about skill building and, more early intervention to prevent disconnection. And that might have a place, but not necessarily within workforce. So I think just that actually is kind of helpful, just hearing the feedback that we don't want to water down the workforce efforts, but there's also maybe there's a place for this to happen. We just need to be more explicit about what we're trying to do in that niche.
Yeah, I would agree. And I think, as we mentioned, so much of it depends on what the budget looks like. And so there's still that process to go through. But yeah, I think we are getting to what we need for sure. We were talking a little, sorry, were you going to say something, Cord?
Just a quick thing, which is I did want to just hear if there are, anything that folks on the committee would like to see, things that we haven't talked about. The big other box at the top, because if there are things emerging trends or issues that we want to pay attention to, I'd like to make sure we capture that.
Of course, I thought you were opening Pandora's box there, so we didn't get any response to that, which hopefully is acknowledgement that those are the key things that this committee wants us to focus on.
Great. Does anybody have anything else on younger youth before we move to the question on older youth? All right. So we sort of just touched on this, but what specific services would you like to see provided to older youth who have obtained their diplomas or GEDs but are uncertain of their next steps?
Jared, this is Jeff. One thing that I would say, just from my professional experience, this is part of the work that we do at Northwest Youth Corps, managing a large AmeriCorps grant specific to Opportunity Youth. And that age range is in that 18 to 24-year-old group. And I think our experience has always been that the better the economy is doing, the better that demographic is doing. Meaning there's a scaffolded set of jobs that are ready to receive people at whatever readiness they are in. And then what happens when the economy tightens or when it's not going as well, many of those folks get squeezed out of the bottom. And I think the thing that gets them squeezed out is just those basic soft skills, those basic sort of resiliency skills, teamwork, ability to show up on time. Those are the things that are excluding them from entry into the workforce or making them a less attractive candidate. And so our experience has always been around those basic soft skill development.
Thank you. Yeah, it sounds like I'm hearing a lot of soft skill development, both for older youth and younger youth, and maybe in this COVID era where specific workforce opportunities are limited, maybe that's something that we could think more about.
Yeah, and I would add soft skill is just such a broad term, and you hear it sometimes described as 21st century skills and other sort of acronyms for it. But I think there are ways for us to encourage that as a priority in terms of the program development. And I think that a lot of our grantees are doing that work at some level, and it might be something that we could become a library of best practices and collect best practices from current grantees to share out across the state.
The other part, Molly, for older youth is really some advocacy for supported employment. I work in juvenile justice. The soft skills are life skills, is what we call them, and what we used to call them, about showing up on time and appropriate clothing and how to interview and how to do a resume, all of those things. But the second is really helping businesses prepare for a younger workforce is also something that that I think that is important, that we're working on.
Hey, Molly, would you share a little bit more about that? I mean, one of the things that I heard someone recently say is that we spend so much time thinking about preparing a generation for the workforce and not as much about preparing the workforce for this incoming generation. What does that look like?
Yeah, so I don't know. I think that would be the interesting piece of what some of the responses may be, whether it is, I don't know the answer to that. If it would be employer meet and greets with prospective youth, and almost a flip to the interview process, right? I'm not really sure what the innovation could be out there, but it definitely seems like it would be worth some energy and time to find out from employers why they're not getting what they're expecting. I don't know. It's just a fascinating piece for us. And then the other is, I also think the advocacy for young adults who are coming off of the juvenile justice system is the process of cleaning up records so that they, the collateral consequences of a juvenile justice piece. I know we're moving to a place where it's not going to cost any money for expunction and some different things, but really helping youth clean up their legal backgrounds so that they can apply for jobs is also important.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Molly. And that sort of gets into the bottom question, some gaps. And we're thinking about what populations can we tap more into and can we provide more support to. So that was something that we touched on. Cord, I see you mentioned a report on essential employment skills. Did you want to talk about that at all?
Yeah, I'll just kind of quickly share a little about this. So there's been some interest at the Workforce Board in trying to get a handle on what are the most important skills to be training young people in to prepare them for the workforce. And I mean, it's a complicated answer because different industries have different answers to this. Part of what they discovered was that there are maybe a set of 3 or 4 core things that are really common, and then each different type of work might have others that are really important to them but might not be important in other places. I mean, one job might want someone who's really good at following instructions, and another job might not need that as much as it needs someone who's really creative. So there are some soft skills that are fairly universal and some that are a little bit more contingent. But what they're trying to do is develop a report that will identify just what are some of the most promising models of curriculum and teaching this stuff for young people. And I was trying to see if I could find a link. I've been assisting just with some of the drafting of the report. I mentioned the equity section because in particular, I think that they're going to hopefully get some funding to try and pilot more of this work. And one of the things that I think is really important is some of this stuff is already happening, like say in maybe a well-resourced high school, whereas in alternative schools and other institutions, it might not be that this stuff is really happening on such a consistent basis. I feel like it's pretty resource dependent. It's also very instructor dependent. So I'm hoping that one of the outcomes is that there is an effort to really look at how you teach this stuff, that there, I think, is a certain level of cultural responsiveness that can be built in, and really understanding how to teach some skills where there might actually be a cultural component. I haven't, the report is going to probably be finished closer to the end of the year, but I feel like it'll be worth bringing back, sharing with the committee. And I think it could be something that influences our grant making as well, in terms of, maybe there are things that we want to take from that and say, hey, we'd actually like to see folks work on this, or employ a certain model that seems very promising, or at least make sure they're aware of it. And yeah, Jeff, you asked when I think that it is due to the governor I think in December. Actually, I was pretty deeply involved, and then things have gotten kind of busy with a few different projects. So I'm just kind of monitoring it. I know I have another meeting about it next week, so I need to dig back in, and I'm happy to share more information about this.
Great, thank you, Cord. That's exciting stuff. Hey, Jared, I'm looking at my clock. I know we've got 10 minutes before we move on to the next agenda item and 2 bullet points, so we probably should move forward.
Yep, absolutely. All right. Does anybody have any final thoughts on older youth in that category that have obtained diplomas or GEDs? No. All right. Last 2 questions. How would you like to see YDD's workforce grants and re-engagement system align? So that is something that the re-engagement project has really been working on, just creating a statewide system. How can we integrate those, our workforce grants with that? We know that there's overlap with the ages that we serve, and of course with disconnected youth who are also currently in workforce grants. Are there ways that you would like to see us align those areas?
It's funny, I thought we had already started to kind of talk about this.
We did, but a little bit.
And we wrote this question before we actually changed our legislative concept to try to expand the age range and re-engagement. So that was part of what led to that. We pondered it, and we talked with ODE and some other folks, and they were like, you know what, go ahead and try it. And so we made that change in part as a way to try to bring more alignment.
Yeah, the one thing I might add is I'm thinking back to the last full council meeting that we had, and there was a conversation, I forget who had inspired it, but there was a conversation around re-engagement and readiness for post-secondary engagement, and how that should align from a re-engagement lens with workforce readiness, like that we shouldn't make any assumptions around that for a young person, and how different those might be in terms of preparing them for more options instead of less. And so that might be one of the places of alignment where workforce is really thinking about that, the actual occupational piece, and the alignment with re-engagement might bring more of that academic or traditional education piece to the front.
Great. Thank you. Anybody else have anything on that? Okay. All right, maybe we can move on to the last question. And there are a few things here. Are there any other gaps in service that we should be addressing with our workforce grants? So are there populations that you would like us to see, or would you like to see us reach out more to? Are there other agencies and entities at the state that we can partner with? We know that there is funding at the Department of Human Services to do similar work. We know that there's proposed funding at HEC to do similar work. Should we reach out to some other entities, see where we could collaborate, try to work together in a meaningful way? What are your thoughts there?
Hey, Jared, I'll start on this one, and I'm thinking Molly's still here. Molly and I both, I remember back in August of 2019 or September when we were looking at these, had sort of expressed some concern around the rural, where our rural communities may not have been receiving as many grants. And so after that, I went and took all the grants and kind of crunched some of the data. And on the workforce and innovation grants, it is true that our rural communities received the short end of that. And it wasn't by intent, it was by circumstance of our process. And so I do want to make sure that that's something that we pay attention to as we build out what the scoring rubric is, or even build in some intentional sensitivity around that. Those workforce and innovation grants, over 90% of them went to organizations that sort of reside within the I-5 corridor. And so I think we want to make sure that we're calibrating for that and putting in some corrective measure for that.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Hey, Jeff, I think I maybe want to respond to that because I'm really excited about some of the things we've done with the Reengagement grant. We had these priority regions, which were based on some data, looking at data indicating need, as well as where YDD grants are not currently active. But what we did with the RFA is we said, so for the Reengagement Opportunity Grant, we will award the top scoring proposal from each of those priority regions. And so like as a first sweep, we make sure that in every region we've prioritized, there will be at least one grant in place. And so something like that, where one thing that has come up in the past is having regions sort of inter-regional competition. But I think that what we want to do is just make sure that we have representation in every part of the state, particularly those where we see a lot of need. And you can do that while still, ultimately ranking and awarding everybody else on the basis of score quality. But taking the top scoring project from each area, I think, is one way that we can do that. We've also set up weighting where we will add 10% to the scores of proposals from those regions we've prioritized. So I think those are two ways that I'm pretty optimistic that we'll see a much more geographically varied spread of awards for re-engagement than we've had for our grants previously. And if those methods work, they might be things we want to look at in the future.
Molly, I didn't want to speak for you on that, but am I right? I think it was both you and I that were kind of trying to scratch our heads and figure that out when we awarded this.
Absolutely, and I really appreciate it. I was just going to read the chat box. I really appreciate just that acknowledgement, and that was one of my questions on getting kind of information back from the people who responded to the RFA to see what the kind of barriers were in some of that. So no, I really appreciate that. That's definitely something we need to be thinking about.
Yeah, and if I remember correctly, that's and I don't mean to disparage anyone. I don't think there was any intent behind that. I think it was just sort of circumstantial the way it worked out in our process. It was also, I think it was about when I came on to the council, and if I remember right, there was some rebuilding of the council itself at that time, and so I think there were a lot of moving parts, and we just didn't have the opportunity or the data to make these kinds of analyses. So so I think we do have that opportunity now. We want to make sure that we calibrate for it.
And I just want to share a shout out to Cord and Anya from YDD of being very intentional about building relationships east of the Cascades. And so I think there's an entirely different relationship thanks to Anya and Cord and Sonji. So I'm feeling really comfortable that they'll be, and I really have appreciated the intentionality of that.
Yeah, agreed. Absolutely. Are there any other comments around the question of gaps in services that we want to make sure we get comments around before moving on to the next agenda item?
So, Jared, this is Molly. I'm going to bring up just one, and I'm not really sure it's a gap or an alignment issue, but this is really something that I would love the staff of YDD is to make sure that we're thinking about this in context of ODE.
Mm-hmm.
Just making sure that you guys are, and I think Brian's on the phone, keeping kind of your eye on the huge landscape of what all of the grants are that are going out through ODE, just to keep us informed on that.
Great. That's a good point. Thank you. All right.
Hey, Mommy, this is Sam. Like, do you mean like the because OD has a lot of grants? Do you mean like Student Investment Act? Do you mean like the you know, the ESSER grants with COVID, the CARES Act, like those sort of things?
Yeah, I think at the management level with ODE, it's a big organization that that as we are able to just represent, I mean, you guys, I'm sure, are doing a great job, but just filling us in on if there's any points of overlap or gaps through the ODE system of, I mean, student success being the big one, Sam, you're right on. And you've heard me talk about that before, so.
I'll just say I think we're trying to strengthen our communication with ODE, particularly on that level. I mean, I know Paul has been engaging in more conversation with Annie Margis, who is the alternative school person for ODE, just to make sure that, you know, when we're working on in a similar zone, we want to have a lot more collaboration and communication. Brian and I are both now attending the ODE executive team meetings. So we're just trying to, one, like learn more about what's happening in the ODE landscape, but also share what we're doing, because that's kind of where I think some of this happens is they hear about stuff, get it to their staff, and then that interaction happens when you know, ODE has more of a sense of what YDD is doing. I think that also supports more collaboration.
Great. All right, I know that we're pretty much at time for this agenda item. So if anybody has any other thoughts on any of these, just feel free to email me.
Jared, one thing I wanted to ask too, I see a lot of initials on this GoToMeeting call, so I don't know exactly who's on here, but if do you invite that from members of the public who might be here in this meeting and then who might review this at a later time once it's posted?
I'm sorry, could you say that again?
Just if somebody was to see this committee meeting and then hear you say, please email me with any suggestions. Is that an open invitation or is that an invitation to committee members? And I'm not sure if we can make that distinction or if it matters.
That's a good question. I'm not sure what the protocol is for that. I think I was directing it to committee members, but I'm not quite sure what the if there's anything sticky there.
I think that you can say yes. I mean, I think some of the folks on the call may potentially be grantees, and we'd always welcome grantees' input on ways we can perform and improve our work. And so, yeah, I don't think there's any harm in opening it up to anyone who might have thoughts.
Great. Thanks, Cord. I never know quite how that works, so I appreciate the guidance there. We're going to move to public comment, and I want to provide an apology in advance if we go. We've only got 13 minutes for this. I have a hard stop at about 11:55 to get to another meeting, but let me hand it over to you, Jared, to hopefully acknowledge and allow our members of the public to provide comment.
Great, thank you. Is there anyone on the phone from the public who would like to speak?
Jared, it's Holly Whittleton from Southeast Works.
Hi, Holly.
Good morning. Good morning, Cord. Good to see you again. And members of the committee. I am going to comment just very quickly because I'm aware of the time, but I wanted to say that in terms of the grant application from 2 years ago, it was repetitive, but I want to tell you, after writing grants for the better part of 20 years, it was the least unengineered grant I ever wrote. So please don't take us to 20 pages like the feds do. It was not over-engineered. It made me think about how to really articulate things in a very clear, concise manner and not go on and on. So I just want to say that. So thank you for that. In terms of initiatives and priorities, I really agree with Sam. Our work over the past 23 years is really about work readiness and workforce development. But we are finding that many of the youth, Sam, get the jobs and lose the jobs. And so that work readiness component is really important. What we've done is that it's hard to measure employment right now. So we've shifted to measuring learning objectives. And we're working with employers from a employer council that we've pulled together locally. And we set up work sites based on stipends and 15 hours a week at $20 an hour. And working with those employers with job descriptions and their expectations to measure those learning objectives to get them ready so that they're ready for a job. I would like to see anything you have, Sam, on curriculum. It would be great. The other thing that I wanted to say is just around populations. Our biggest challenge in trying to get to this particular population, BIPOC young women with children. They are out of the system. It's predominantly males, even in the justice system, who can come to us. They don't have children, easy to access. They don't have to worry about childcare. But BIPOC young women, our largest challenge. And then the last thing is, I'm not into your funding deal, but you know I do this for a living too. I don't know if you've ever thought of SNAP, the match on the 50-50 through the federal USDA program on non-federal funds. And so we're doing that in many of our programs now that have non-federal funds. We're able to match each one of those dollars with a 50-50 match through USDA. So I just put that out there. I think it could expand your pool, and it's expanding our pool in terms of the funds that we have coming in. So thank you for my 5 minutes there.
Thank you, Holly. Is there anybody else who'd like to comment?
I'm just curious, you know, the people on participating via phone, are they able to see the chat? I'm wondering, because I did put the I did put the information on wages in the chat. So I'm just wondering, perhaps if, like, when we have at our next meeting for people, when people participate via phone, if they could also be sent the GoToMeeting hyperlink so they could participate via GoToMeeting so they can see the chats and so forth.
Sure.
And wages stands for working at gaining employment skills. Yeah, working at gaining employment skills, and that stands for wages. Yeah.
Thanks, Sam. And I don't believe people on the phone can see the chat, so that's good to think about. Is there anybody else from the public?
I just wanted to respond quickly to, I did put it in the chat, but I don't know if Holly is able to see the chat or not. So I'll just note that, I mean, those are all really good comments, and we're working right now to strengthen our collaboration with PHS. So I'm going to add Snap 50/50 to our agenda for things we want to talk about, because I think it would be really helpful for us to at least know how to align what we're doing with some of that funding.
Great. Any other members of the public? Anyone on the phone? Okay.
Great. Well, Jared, thank you for your guidance and facilitation. Actually, I want to put a big thank you to Paul and Cord and Jared for all the work preparing for this meeting, and then your facilitation as we went through it. Brian, thank you for joining us and getting to see the talented staff at their best when they're working on this stuff with us. Thank you, committee members, for taking time today to join us in this thoughtful conversation. Again, I would just remind anyone on the call to get back in touch with Jared if you have any epiphanies around the questions that were asked here. This is how we can get the work done. This is how, at the committee structure, we can have impact on both the local community and the state in terms of our efforts around workforce and re-engagement. So a lot of gratitude for this team for gathering, and also some gratitude for getting the free 3 minutes, coming in a little bit under time. And thank you, Holly, for joining us as a member of the public. With that, at 11:54 on November 12th, Thursday, I will call the Workforce and Re-engagement Committee of the Youth Development Council in adjournment.